I was finally able to buy an RTX 5050. Nvidia sort of just shoved these out the door with no review program and didn't even have an official launch date, so I kept my eyes on stores when they were available in the United States. I was finally able to get one and it did just ship to me. Now, this video is going to be a bit of a different sort of review because honestly, if you can spend a bit more money on a graphics card, you should. So I'll just say that right there. This is not a good value compared to cards that cost more. But what if you can only spend $250 and you're just wondering, what is it actually like to game on this thing? So let me stop here for a second. What are we gonna focus on here? So if you just review graphics cards in the traditional manner of maximum settings, native resolution, this card is gonna look awful. And again, I wanna be clear right now, this card is not good value when you compare it against other stuff that costs just a little bit more. In other words, if you can spend a little bit more, it's worth it to do so. I'll talk more about that later in the video. But if this is kind of your price range and you're just wondering, what would it be like to play games on this if I want to play new games and this is my price range, that's why I'm gonna focus on testing not just maximum settings at native resolution like we're seeing here, where we're only a little over 30 FPS, in a big new Unreal Engine 5 game like Clair Obscure Expedition 33, my favorite game of the year, by the way. Definitely check it out if you haven't yet. But what if we actually played at medium settings? Well, actually we're down pretty close to 60 FPS, but not only that, in this video, in addition to testing native resolution at maximum and medium settings, I'm also gonna be testing them out using DLSS quality when we're looking at 1080p. Because with newer DLSS models, quality at 1080p looks pretty good, and I imagine most people on a budget system will actually end up using this. And I'm also gonna test out if you did target a 1440p monitor, again, native resolution in this case, even with medium settings, might be pretty rough. But what if you use something like DLSS balanced, which I think is, here we go, completely reasonable to do, especially on this class of hardware, but just in general, again, newer DLSS models with balanced setting look pretty good at 1440p output. See what kind of performance we can get here. So again, if you can afford to spend a bit more, you probably should. This is not a good value graphics card, more on that and why I'm saying that towards the end of the video. But for now, let's focus in on what is the experience actually like trying to play the newest games on this. So as we can see here, by the way, this is the Gigabyte Gaming OC. I did buy this. This is not a review sample or anything. So if you want to click like the join button to directly support the channel financially, it helps me do things like buy graphics card that Nvidia doesn't seem to want to actually be reviewed because they just shove it out the door. I don't know, guys. Anyway. So what are we looking at here? Maybe I'll be in the middle. So trying to play Unreal Engine 5 game like Clair Obscure Expedition 33 at max settings at 1080p native resolution, not great. Mid 30 FPS range, 1% lows or below 30. But if you go to medium settings, you can actually get around 60 FPS. And guys, I want you to look at the side-by-side here. Does medium really look that much worse than max? It's hard to even spot a lot of the differences. Just saying. What if we go down to DLSS quality with the 1080p monitor output? At maximum settings are actually pretty close, but not quite at 60 FPS now. And at the medium settings, again using DLSS quality, actually at a pretty decent overall frame rate here in the mid 80s. And sure, this isn't necessarily the absolute most demanding scene of the game or anything like that, but it is fairly demanding as things go, and this gives you some headroom to stay over 60 FPS and all of that. By the way, again, if you're looking at the temperatures and things like that in this video, this is the Gigabyte Gaming OC model. So it looks like here we're maintaining just under 60 Celsius on the temps and all that. Now, what if we jump up to 1440p? So you have a 1440p monitor. You can see that we're running out of VRAM on the left-hand side of the screen. It's stuttering horribly. Starts to get the stutters a little bit under control as we proceed a little bit more in the benchmark, but still the frame rates are only in the low 20s. You're not gonna be playing this game maxed out on 1440p display, but again, it is a budget graphics card. I hate that $250 is a budget graphics card these days. I remember when that got you a pretty decent mid-range card, but maybe I'm just an old man and grumpy. I don't know. Anyway, 1440p medium, though, is actually completely playable at about 42 FPS here. And while that's playable, though, I do think it would make sense to use DLSS in this situation. I want to be clear that I'm talking about DLSS upscaling. I'm not testing frame generation in this video. This card does support multi-frame generation, so you got your ×2, ×3, and ×4 modes. If you want a high refresh rate display, that could be interesting. But for that to be worthwhile, you need to achieve a decent base frame rate. It doesn't, I know some people use it this way, but I don't think it's a good experience going from like 30 FPS to 100 FPS using ×4 frame gen, but using it off of a decent base frame rate, like in the 50 to 70 FPS range, I think works pretty well, which you can see here. Max settings, 1440p DLSS balanced, actually just under 50 FPS. Medium settings, which like I said, look pretty close to the max settings to my eye, getting you around 75 FPS, so pretty good situation there. So I think we could say that you could play Clair Obscure Expedition 33 on this GPU on a 1080p or 1440p display if you're willing to tune the settings appropriately. Now here, if you're thinking the max settings look worse than the medium settings right now, it's because the maximum textures aren't loading in on Monster Hunter Wilds. This game absolutely needs more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM for the higher texture settings, and that's the issue that we're seeing here, meaning that not only are the medium settings running better right now, they actually look better because of the maximum textures failing to load. So there's that. Anyway, so definitely don't try to use the maximum settings, even at 1080p in Monster Hunter Wilds on an 8 gigabyte graphics card. That being said, even the medium settings are only actually averaging in the mid 40s right now. And then, some scenes like this one are actually only hitting like 38, 39 FPS momentarily. So even medium settings at native resolution in Monster Hunter Wilds is a bit rough. And like I said, max settings are just completely off the table. It doesn't even load correctly. So it's not like just accept lower frame rate to get better visuals. It actually just looks worse too. Using DLSS quality does not free up enough VRAM to get the higher resolution textures to load in on the maximum settings, so that does not solve the maximum settings problems. However, at medium settings, it does give a decent frame rate boost to where it's still not going to be averaging 60 FPS in the more demanding scenes. But in much of the game, you'll be close to 60 FPS. More demanding areas will dip to 50 or even into the 40s at times. But playing this game on a controller would still be doable at these settings. But again, the RTX 5050, even at upscaling, even using medium graphics settings at just a 1080p output, can't necessarily achieve a 60 FPS lock in the more demanding, or we might say less optimized titles released in 2025. That certainly is the case here with Monster Hunter Wilds, so just be aware of that. But is the game playable on the 5050? It is playable on the 5050, just not an amazing experience. But, that is what it is. Like I said, if you pay a little bit more, you can get a lot more graphics card. But if this is your budget, you can definitely play the game on a 1080p display. How does it do on a 1440p display? 1440p max settings, native resolution are, again, not loading textures properly, so it looks bad, and performance is way below 30 FPS. Not the way you're going to want to do it. Now, even going down to medium settings doesn't completely solve our performance problems. It solves the VRAM issue, so it's no longer stuttery and it's actually loading the textures properly. But we're still only talking about averages in the 30 FPS range, with the most demanding bits even dipping occasionally slightly below 30 FPS. As we'll see here, I think the most demanding piece of this pass is this scene that we're at right now, where we can see the frame rates are currently at about, hit as low as about 27 FPS, and that's being reported as our 1% lows now. So native 1440p on this card in Monster Hunter Wilds, not going to be a great experience. Also, if you go down to the low settings in this game, it just looks truly horrendous. So I don't think going below the medium settings is a good idea. However, we can use upscaling here. And that's what we're looking at here. So if you use balanced level DLSS, which again on a 1440p output does look pretty good, We can see that it does not salvage the maximum settings. There's still horrible frame time graph and failing to load textures properly, so that's out the window. On the medium settings, it's definitely not going to be a 60 FPS experience. I'm sure there are sections of the game that can run at 60 FPS, but that's certainly not going to be the typical result. A more typical result is going to be around 50 FPS, and then the more demanding areas in the mid 40s or even around 40 FPS. Again, let's go ahead and see as we jump down here into the grassy plains with all of the monsters on screen. We can see that the momentary frame rates are dipping to right about 40 and even as low as about 38 or 39. So the 1% lows, for example, now are reporting as 39 FPS through this scene. But as somebody who plays a lot on my Steam Deck, I will say that on a controller, a 40 FPS is a playable experience. It's not a great experience, but it's a playable experience. And it's also light years ahead of a 30 FPS experience. So, can you play Monster Hunter Wilds on the RTX 5050? Yes, but even at 1080p and also 1440p, a 60 FPS lock isn't a great experience. Let's look at Doom: The Dark Ages. The max settings, which are Ultra Nightmare, but not using the path tracing settings, I think that's just a bridge too far. 1080p native resolution is actually playable at around 50 FPS. It does dip below that. Medium settings, though, are closer to 60, but still not 60 FPS. So still trouble to get to a good 60 FPS lock at native 1080p. Now, using DLSS quality, which again does look pretty good at 1080p now with the latest models, does kind of save the day here with the maximum settings other than DLSS quality as opposed to native resolution, getting the 1% lows a little bit below 60, but the average is closer to 70, and the medium settings averaging closer to 80 with even the 1% lows reporting at 65. Now, moving up to a 1440p display starts to have a lot more issues. The Ultra Nightmare settings at a native 1440p are only about a 30 FPS experience with the 1% lows dropping noticeably below that, hitting as low as 22 FPS when the ship crashes there. 1440p medium native TAA, we're getting 37 FPS average, but 1% lows are below 30 at 28 FPS. However, DLSS Balanced does put in a lot of work here. The maximum settings only boost up to, looks like about 38, 39 FPS or so. I think it's running into some VRAM issues. Whereas on the medium settings, we're getting all the way up into around 60 FPS. Now, when that ship crashes, the 1% lows do dip as low as 48. But the overall average through this scene, which is one of the more demanding, not the most, but one of the more demanding areas of the game, do end up averaging about 60 FPS. So can you play Doom: The Dark Ages on this GPU? Yes, on both 1080p and 1440p, but again, some significant compromises to the settings to get there. What about Oblivion Remastered, which is wrapping an Unreal Engine 5 graphics layer around the older Oblivion game? Well, don't try out the max settings even at 1080p. You're going to be well beyond your 8 gigabytes of VRAM, causing stutters, well beyond the normal stutters the game just has anyway, with 1% lows in the teens and the averages well below 30. At medium settings, with hardware RT turned off, software lumen low, we're averaging 53 FPS, 1% lows in the 40s, so it's playable but not a 60 FPS experience. However, using DLSS quality on the medium settings does get us into a pretty good experience. It doesn't save the day on the max settings though. We're still over 8 gigabytes of VRAM usage here, and so 1080p max settings are just going to be off the table on this 8 gigabyte graphics card. We're averaging under 30 FPS still despite using DLSS. With 1% lows in the teens, and look at that frame time graph. Just stutter, 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 stutter. It's not great. 1080p medium settings, software lumen low, with DLSS quality does average in the mid-80s with 1% lows around 60. However, there's nothing you can do to stop the game from just randomly stuttering whenever it loads a new zone, but that's just the game itself on any hardware. What if you're trying to play this on a 1440p display? Well, definitely don't try out the max settings, even if you're like, I'm okay with 30 FPS. Well, you're not going to get 30 FPS, you're going to get 12. Well, I mean, it might go up a little bit at times, but it's not a great experience. You're well over your 8 gigabytes of VRAM, let alone the graphical horsepower to run this game. And then the 1440p medium settings are not great either. We're only averaging in the mid 30s, 1% lows around 30. So, I mean, if you were trying for a 30 FPS experience, I guess you could do native 1440p medium settings, but I don't think that's going to be the optimal choice. I really think that if you're trying to use an RTX 5050 in newer games on a 1440p display, you're going to be relying heavily on upscaling. So how does that work out? 1440p max settings DLSS balanced. Still doesn't solve the VRAM issue, so you're just kind of hanging out in the 20s with 1% lows and the barely in the double digits at all with a spiky frame time graph. Whereas the medium settings, again with software lumen low, we are actually averaging over 60 FPS, 1% lows only in the 40s. Again, that does go up at times. Really, there's just some stutters in this game that you just can't really solve based on your graphical settings. It's just kind of stuttery. So there's that. However, the overall averages, as good as this game can get, can be somewhat smooth. Now, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, at its maximum settings at a native 1080p, also goes over 8 gigabytes of VRAM and also is just incredibly demanding. So only averaging around 20 FPS there. However, if you look at the medium settings, not a huge graphical downgrade there, but the frame rate is significantly better. This is a game that you actually can play at native 1080p if you'd like. Medium settings get you into the 80-something FPS range. And look at how much smoother the frame time graph is here, and look at how close the 1% lows are to the averages. It's a beautiful thing. This game is actually extremely well optimized and gives you some smooth frame time graphs, buttery smooth experience. It's a beautiful thing to see. Now, if you do kick on DLSS quality, you can push frame rates even further. On the experimental settings, which are the maximum settings on the left-hand side of the screen, DLSS quality does reduce VRAM usage just enough to be under 8 gigabytes, so performance does go up significantly. There's a huge difference between 30 FPS and 20 FPS, percentage-wise and frame time-wise, but it's still not a great experience, and it is still below 30 FPS. The medium settings using DLSS quality, though, are now into triple digits. Realistically, you could probably target higher graphic settings than medium, and then either stay at native resolution or maybe use DLSS quality and still get some pretty high frame rates. Like I said, this game is well optimized enough to give you a lot of options, so that's pretty cool to see. What if you're trying to play it on a 1440p display? Well, don't use the max settings. they go over 8 gigabytes of VRAM and are incredibly demanding, and it's a slideshow. However, this is the, it's still not going to give you a locked 60 FPS. This is the first game we've seen so far where a native 1440p medium is anywhere near a 60 FPS experience. Here we're looking at the upper 50s when using the native TAA. Once again, though, the frame time graphs are so smooth and the 1% lows are so close to the averages. It's a nice thing to see. So I think 1440p native TAA would actually be a very reasonable way to play this game, especially a game this slow paced. Hanging out just under 60 FPS I think is fine as long as you're on a variable refresh rate display. That being said, though, using DLSS balanced can get you additional headroom. On the maximum settings, though, at 1440p output, we're still over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and it's causing performance to remain an utter slideshow. However, medium settings with DLSS balanced are now not only over 60 FPS, it's over 80 FPS. So hanging out around 80 FPS with even the 1% lows in the upper 70s looks like a pretty good experience here. So Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is a very scalable game, and as long as you stay off of the absolute maximum settings, I think the RTX 5050 can do just fine here at both 1080p and 1440p. And this is one of the games where you might even play at a native resolution, although DLSS does still get you some good performance boosts. And now let's take a look at Spider-Man 2. Its maximum settings with maxed out ray tracing and all that go well above 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Heck, they go above 12 gigabytes of VRAM a lot of the time. So it's well under 30 FPS. You're not going to be able to max this game out. At 1080p medium, though, Even native resolution does fine here. Frame time graphs are still a little bit gross on this game. You get these spikes all the time. That's a bit annoying. But overall averages are in the mid 70s, and 1% lows, not quite as nice because this game's just still not quite as optimized as I'd like it to be there. Now, using DLSS quality, though, does boost the medium settings frame rates frequently into the triple digits. You're kind of hanging out around 100 FPS, although once again, there's still these little spikes here and there. So the 1% lows have a larger gap between the averages than I would really like for a super smooth, consistent experience. But again, the maximum settings, even using DLSS quality, doesn't get you anywhere near to be within an 8GB VRAM barrier, buffer, I mean, and so that's just not really, not going to be the way to go there. Now, moving up to 1440p, again, max settings are just completely off the table. However, using medium settings does get you a reasonably playable experience. You're around 50 FPS a lot of the time. However, frame time graphs not looking as smooth as I'd like. 1% lows are pretty bad. And again, overall averages are still well below 60 FPS. So I think this is another situation where you would definitely be wanting to use DLSS if you're on a 1440p display. So let's go ahead and kick that on. So kicking on DLSS balanced on the 1440p output. Again, maximum settings still going to be below 30 FPS with a horribly spiky frame time graph and well above 8 gigabytes of VRAM buffer. However, medium settings, DLSS balanced, are now averaging in around the 70 FPS range most of the time. Again, still not the smoothest frame time graph I've ever seen, but this game kind of be like that anyway. And, 1% lows around 40. And the point is, the game is now completely playable on the 1440p display using medium settings with the DLSS balanced output. Now, Assassin's Creed Shadows can be a game that is, again, really, really hard to run at max settings and can go beyond an 8GB VRAM buffer on its maximum settings. So we can see that we're down in the teens a lot of the time at the maximum settings at 1080p. Now, going down to medium settings, and I should be clear here that this game offers a lot of ray tracing scalability. Here I've turned off the ray tracing as much as possible. It's set to hideout only, and I don't think this is the hideout. So we're kind of testing what it's like with no ray tracing versus maxed out ray tracing, as well as the other settings. Now here, by going down to medium settings, I will say in most games I didn't see a big difference between max and medium, if we're being honest. Here I see a pretty significant difference in both the lighting and like the hair and facial animation quality and all of that. So you get a lot of frame rate back, but there's definitely some pretty noticeable hits to the overall graphical quality at the medium settings. But it is getting a lot of scalability on the table, which is nice to see. So we are seeing around 60 FPS, although just a bit under it, compared to around 20 FPS. So tons of scalability available. However, like I said, compared to some games, like remember the first game, Clair Obscure Expedition 33, where I was looking at the max settings and the medium settings, and honestly, it's pretty hard to pick out the differences. The lighting, the shadows, the reflections, the foliage, the textures here, max versus medium, is a pretty significant downgrade, and this game is designed around ray-traced global illumination as part of its kind of design philosophy, so that is something to keep in mind. However, if you just want to play the game, it's certainly still playable. Using DLSS in this game, though, interestingly, I've noticed that this game does not scale as much with rendering resolution as most games that we've tested. So notice that maximum settings DLSS quality are still extremely low, well under 30 FPS. The medium settings are now over 60 FPS, and they were below 60 FPS, but we've seen some games give a much larger performance bump by using DLSS quality as opposed to native. This gives a performance bump for sure, but not as big as we've seen in some other titles. That's kind of interesting. Now, I've seen that looking at some of the developer talks and things about this game, it seems like they've done some actual simulation stuff in the game that many other games might do on the CPU, but they're, I think, doing some of that on the GPU, which I don't think that would scale with the rendering resolution of the game. So that might give some explanation why using things like DLSS or changing the resolution doesn't have as much of a performance scaling ability as I've seen in some other games. That being said, though, like I said, going from maximum settings with a bunch of ray tracing to medium settings with ray tracing turned off certainly is quite scalable. So we're seeing the difference here between about 24 FPS average and about 73 FPS average. And the medium settings with DLSS quality are even getting the 1% lows over 60. So as long as you're within your VRAM buffer, the 1% lows are pretty smooth in this game and all of that. So anyway, the game is completely playable and still looks completely fine, even if there is a pretty significant downgrade from the maximum settings. Now, moving up to 1440p resolution, again, max settings are going to be completely off the table, kind of in the teens. Medium settings, on the other hand, like I said, scaling with resolution, at 1080p native medium settings, we were kind of in the mid to upper 50s. Using 1440p native, we're still in the 40-something FPS range, so it's actually not completely unplayable. This is a style of game I would definitely personally use a controller for. 40 FPS on a controller on a budget system, not the absolutely unreasonable or end-of-the-world situation. That being said, I probably would use some DLSS upscaling, which we will check here in a minute. But again, playable on the 1440p output. And like I said, this game does seem to just scale differently with resolution than most of the other games we've tested. By the way, I don't think I've mentioned power draw yet so far. So most of the scenes were reporting around 120 to 130 watts of usage. And so it's a little shame that some 50 series cards in the past have been able to just be slot powered off of the PCIe slot. And we're definitely nowhere near that territory on this card. So there is that. It's not a huge amount of power draw, but you are gonna definitely actually need a PCIe power cable from your power supply and all of that. So not as appropriate to those like Dell Optiplex kind of like grab an office PC, slot in a slot powered GPU kind of situation, as we've seen in some previous 1650 style 50 series car 50 class cards, I should say. Anyway, let's go ahead and check out using DLSS balanced in this game. So going all the way from native resolution to DLSS balanced, which is a significant rendering resolution downgrade, takes us from the mid 40s up to, around 60 FPS. So can you get around a 60 FPS experience in Assassin's Creed Shadows on the RTX 5050? You absolutely can. But again, the medium settings, with a lot of upscaling, does have to be employed. And again, you can see a lot of changes to pretty much every rendering element of the game, right? The global illumination, the shadows, the textures, all of that, pretty significant difference. But again, performance is up to around 60-something FPS here. Even the upper 60s and even pushing into the 70s at times on the 1440p output here. All right, this benchmark runs on for a while. I think I'm going to go ahead and skip forward in a little bit, getting a little bored of Assassin's Creed Shadows for the moment. So by the end of the benchmark run, it looks like we are hitting kind of 66 FPS average at the 1440p medium DLSS balanced, with 1% lows just a little under 60 at 56. Now I'm going to look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. This is using an older engine. It's a variant on Unreal Engine 4. The max settings and the medium settings in this game don't have a huge difference, although I've noticed at the max settings you can occasionally go over an 8GB VRAM, but it doesn't always happen as I run through this pass. It's just occasionally it kind of triggers and tanks performance. So the medium settings might be more appropriate, or at least choosing the correct texture settings. Now, that being said, even at the maximum settings in this game, you're averaging around 60 FPS, but it certainly does dip below it. 1% lows aren't great in this game at all, really. But the average is around 60 FPS here and around 70-ish on the medium settings. Kicking on DLSS quality does help out both the max settings and the medium settings to settle into some higher overall average frame rates. It helps out the 1% lows as well, but again, I always see a spiky frame time graph when I test this game out. Just something not quite as smooth as it could be, however this game is rendering. Now, as we can see here, this little river bit is one of the more demanding bits as we round this corner, but doing absolutely fine on both. So it's looking like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is going to give you a pretty good experience on this GPU at 1080p, but what about 1440p? 1440p max settings are not going to be a 60 FPS experience. Going to definitely be into the 40s at times. And again, I would keep my eye on the VRAM usage because it can occasionally flip over and give you some problems. 1440p medium settings are close to a 60 FPS average, but not quite there. In this kind of town area that we're running through right now, it looks like we're kind of averaging in the mid 50s. Again, the 1% lows don't look great, but that's not just this GPU. It just always seems to be the case for me in this game on basically any hardware I'm testing, unless you can just smash right into its like frame rate cap. So you might want to look into frame rate capping this game to smooth things out a bit anyway. Now, if we kick on DLSS quality at 1440p, this game doesn't offer DLSS balanced. It really offers percentages. It offers 100%, 66%, and 50%. So that corresponds to native resolution, DLSS quality, and DLSS performance. So since there was no DLSS balanced mode on offer in this game, I just stuck to DLSS quality at 1440p. And this game had high enough performance that did end up being all we needed. Even the maximum settings here are averaging around 60 FPS, although it does dip below it for sure. And the 1440p medium settings are averaging close to 70 FPS here, actually hitting about 69, which is perfectly nice. All right, so that is what it looks like to game on the RTX 5050 in the latest games released in 2025, looking at big AAA titles. If you're playing, if you're like, why didn't you test any esports games or anything like that? Honestly, this card is going to be absolutely fine if you're mostly buying an esports card, especially playing like competitive titles at low graphics settings. That's where really you're not stressing the GPU much at all in most competitive titles, and you just want to make sure your CPU can keep up and all of that. So as a competitive card, this can definitely get the job done. But this video is focusing on, can you play the latest AAA single-player games on a 1080p or 1440p display? And I think the answer is yes, you can play them, but there's not a lot of headroom for future scalability. What I mean by that is you're already kind of maximum settings off the table. And medium settings can often get you to around but a little bit short of 60 FPS at 1080p. And realistically, you're already probably going to be using a combination of reduced graphic settings and DLSS, even on a 1080p display, to get the kind of frame rates you're looking for, which absolutely is working. In the vast majority of these games, we can find some way to hit around 60 FPS. The less optimized games like Monster Hunter Wilds, even at medium settings with DLSS quality on a 1080p display, you're absolutely gonna dip below 60 FPS, but not badly below, meaning like it's still playable. So what I'm really trying to get at here is that the RTX 5050 can play the latest AAA games on a 1080p display at reduced settings and often using DLSS, which isn't a great place to be in, but it is usable. For a 1440p display, even reduced settings don't usually get you there, especially in the more demanding games like Monster Hunter Wilds, and you're having to use a lot of DLSS as well, and even then you can see oftentimes falling short of 60 FPS. Again, less demanding titles, not gonna be as big of an issue. Like, let's see, I think Clair Obscure Expedition 33, medium settings, DLSS balanced, you're over 70 FPS a lot of the time. So the 5050 can absolutely be used to play the latest games, big AAA titles, on both the 1080p and 1440p display, usually at reduced settings and using DLSS. What that means is, as more demanding titles come out, there's less scalability on offer if you've already had to use all that scalability to get a good experience in the first place. Does that make sense? Meaning, the 5050 is perfectly usable right now in the latest AAA titles at appropriate settings. But I'm a little hesitant to say it's gonna be still giving a great experience, 3, 4, 5 years from now, so just be aware of that. Competitive titles I don't think are gonna be an issue, which is why I didn't focus my testing there. But the last thing I wanna mention is the other real problem with the 5050 is that if you spend just a little bit more money, you're gonna get more value. Does that make sense? Like the frames per dollar get better if you spend more, not worse, at least for the next couple of GPUs available. So the RTX 5050, most of the models in the US are either out of stock or never went into stock that I've seen. I do see that there is one available at $250. The one I bought right here is currently $270. The thing is, as you're at that price point, I understand some people's budgets just do not permit anything above this, which is why I focused the video on what will your experience actually be like on this GPU, and can you play the latest games? And the answer is yes at the right settings. But let's see what you could get for a little bit more money. An RTX 5060 comes available at its MSRP of $300. Now, that's going to be 20% more money. But on average, it's more than 20% faster. I'm going to do my own head-to-head, but if we just want to look at like, Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart right now for a second, you can see that they have the 5050 scaling up to the 5060, as the 5060 being 27% faster. Again, I'm going to do my own testing, but that kind of gives you the idea that 20% more money gives you 27% more performance, or if you're willing to go the AMD route, let's see what the 9060 8GB cards cost right now. So a 9060 8GB card, some of them are as low as $250, although I'm pretty sure that's with like a $50 promotional gift card. So it's really $300 plus you get a $50 back gift card. You're seeing some maybe coming in available at least soon on Amazon for around $280, meaning you're barely spending more money. And then if you factor in gift cards, maybe even not spending any more money to get a 9060 XT. And the 9060 XT is actually more powerful than the 5060, let alone the 5050. Although again, you're going the AMD route. I understand some people are just gonna buy Nvidia. And there's reasons for that, but 32% more performance than the 5050 for 20% more money, according to Tech PowerUp's chart. Again, stay tuned to the channel, and I am gonna do a bunch of head-to-head comparisons here. Now, if you're willing to scale your budget up even more, you can get the 9060 XT, not XT, but 16GB version. So the 9060 16GB, again, not available right now. It's at $350 MSRP, and I understand that $370 in many ways is a completely different world than a $250 graphics card like you're getting here. But do keep in mind that the 16GB of VRAM is gonna give you a lot more headroom for the future in single player titles, and the additional performance, they've got it about 39% faster on Tech PowerUp, and depending on the situation and the VRAM situation, it can end up being a lot more than that. But I understand that now we're talking like $370 compared to $250, you're talking 48% more money. It's a huge price increase. I totally understand that. So again, this video isn't to try to shame you into buying a more expensive graphics card. It's to show you that this is absolutely usable even in AAA games. It's just you're already having to use a lot of the scalability settings now. So in the future, I don't think it's going to age particularly well. And from a value proposition, if you spend just a little bit more money to get like the 8GB 9060 XT or even the 5060 8GB, you're gonna get more performance per dollar because, like I said, 20% more money is getting you more than 20% increase in performance. Now, if you wanna see dedicated head-to-head videos of the 5050 up against the 9060 8GB, the 5060 8GB, all of that, and probably more, maybe get some Intel options in there as well, stay tuned to the channel. I have all those cards tested in these same settings, but it does take a long time to edit that side-by-side footage and put together bar graphs and all of that. But stay tuned to the channel over the coming weeks, and I'm sure all that content will come out. But this video was mostly just like, so what does it actually look like to game on this thing? And I wanted to get some content on it quickly after getting it, because again, the weird launch without review samples and whatnot. So anyway, hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Again, I did have to buy this thing, so feel free to kick on the join button if you're able to directly support the channel financially. If you can't, it's perfectly understandable. And viewers, subscribers are all absolutely appreciated. You're all beautiful people, and I hope you have an excellent day.